Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. Today's lecture is on great player from the past, Harry Nelson Pillsbury, and this is on his best endgames. And we have a few endgames to look at today, if we can get to all of them. Pillsbury was probably best player in the world for a while, but he was sick at a very young age. He died at a very young age. And for the casual chess fan, he's probably most famous for winning Hastings 1895 tournament ahead of the reigning world champion Lasker and the previous world champion Steinitz, as well as several other people who would play for the world championship. And Pillsbury never got a match for the world championship, probably because, at that time, before FIDE took over the world championship, world champions typically chose their opponents, and they didn't necessarily want to choose somebody who would beat them. So Lasker may have been ducking Pillsbury, possible. But yeah, Pillsbury died at the young age of 33, and Hastings tournament, he won when he was just 22. And he's was the American champion for the last few years of his life. And you can read more about him in the Wikipedia. And as I say this every week, I'm furious at how short the Wikipedia articles are for these great chess players. I mean, for somebody like Pillsbury, this is way too short. I want to thank our sponsor, James A. Williams from Galax, Virginia, and he has a message. I hope this inspires a great author to do a masterwork on Harry Nelson Pillsbury. Thank you. And my dogs thank you also. So thanks for our sponsor, James Williams, watching the lecture live. And the dogs found something to bark at, as they do during my lectures. Before my lectures, they're fine. So Pillsbury was born in 1872, died in 1906. And he had success in some tournaments, but because of his illness, even when he was winning tournaments or playing in strong tournaments, he was usually sick. And a player that I've done a lecture on, but it's been, I think, 3 or 4 years, Jackson Showalter. Pillsbury beat Showalter in a match, even though Pillsbury was sick in 1897. And his lifetime record against Lasker was 50%, which is pretty good against the reigning world champion. And when I was a kid, the only thing I knew about Pillsbury was he won Hastings 1895, and he was good at blindfold chess, which wasn't very common at that time. But he could play many people blindfolded at once, confusing the audience. It says his maximum was 22 players blindfold in Moscow in 1902. That's the most he ever played. And he also was good at memorizing long lists of numbers and such. And unfortunately, Wikipedia article doesn't have more, but Pillsbury played a lot of chess considering he died so young. There's a lot of great games that you can find on a database, or if you can find a book on Pillsbury. Now, when I lived in Michigan, there's a senior master, 2400 USCF, and he was a bookseller, and his name is Fred Lindsay. And he started a publishing company called Pawn Island Press. And one of the first books he published was books on Pillsbury, written by a local author who was probably like a Class B or a Class A player. But I'm sure that those books are good because the guy did a detailed, the guy did a lot of research at the time. And those books were written like 25, 30 years ago. And I'm sure there's other books on Pillsbury, but there's probably not a definitive work by, somebody like Kasparov, who wrote My Great Predecessors. Obviously, Kasparov would know how strong Pillsbury was, but since he wasn't the world champion, I think he wasn't included in that series that Kasparov wrote. Although it seems like for a time, Pillsbury was better than Steinitz and Lasker, but they just didn't have a lot of world championship matches at that time, unlike now, where there's always a world championship match. So, and as I said earlier, often the most deserving players didn't play in the matches. It was people that could raise money, because typically it was up to the challenger to raise money for the matches. But I've always had a high esteem for Pillsbury because he beat basically everybody in the world in his short career. And unfortunately, like when he passed away in 1906, 33 was probably like the peak of chess. And I remember when I was a kid, I asked my dad, when do chess players reach their peak? What age? And he said 35, which would be very funny now, but this was in the 1970s. And nowadays, a lot of chess players reach their peak at 25. And 35 is actually considered old now for a strong grandmaster. And most players in the top 10, top 20 in the world are under the age of 35. And even somebody like Hikaru, who's like 37, I think, they make fun of him for being old. I mean, but when Pillsbury passed away, he was probably near the height of his powers. And you can't expect in the 1890s that somebody who's 22 has reached their chess peak. That wasn't the case then. And he still won Hastings. Okay, enough of my blabbering. Let's look at the games. This game we actually looked at, I don't know, about 6 months ago. I never know how the time goes. Sometimes when I think it's been 6 months, it's been 3 years, or sometimes it's been 1 month. But this was an ending of all the endings that we have today that were recommended by the sponsor. This is the one that I knew from being a kid because I saw it in some Endgame chess book. This is the game Pillsbury Gunsberg from Hastings 1895, famous tournament. And this position, Gunsberg played knight b8, stopping white's pawn from going forward. And Pillsbury had a very interesting move in this position, played the move f5, which wouldn't occur to most people since black has 2 pawns protecting f5, white only has 1 defending it. But the idea is if white gets in knight f4 after, say, double trading knight f4, there's no defense to the d5 pawn. White has 2 connected passed pawns. Black has terrible pawn structure. Frankly, terrible. So that's what Pillsbury was going for. Okay, Gunsberg said, I don't want you to play knight f4, although I'm not sure if he said it out loud, but he was definitely thinking it. And he played the move g5, stopping knight f4. Okay, now Pillsbury must have seen very far ahead to play the next move. Played the move knight b4. And the following, I don't want to call it a combination, but the following sequence of moves must have been seen by Pillsbury before he played knight b4. And what knight b4 does is it puts pressure on d5. So if we ever take on f5, knight takes d5 check. And it helps white play c6 and c7 because the knight defends the c6 square. Gunsberg played the obvious move, a5, and if Pillsbury moves his knight away, then knight b4 doesn't make a lot of sense. So Pillsbury played c6. And again, it's imperative that Pillsbury sees almost to the end of the game to play moves like knight b4 and c6. Now, obviously, if you take c7 is winning, we're threatening the queen on c8, and we're threatening the queen on b8, and I'm gonna promote on one of those squares. So black has to play king d6. And now it looks like maybe Pillsbury messed up because all of Pillsbury's guys are hanging. He just played knight b4, that's attacked. Just played c6, and that's attacked. But Pillsbury ignored those attacks and took on e6. And the idea is, if you take on b4, I play e7. There's only one move that stops e8 equals queen, and that's king takes e7. Then c7 wins again, just like it did before. So Pillsbury must have seen this when he played knight b4, and he must have also seen the move that was played in the game, knight takes c6. Because if this is good for black, then knight b4 is not a good move, and c6 isn't a good move. But Pillsbury took, and then this is the key move for the rest of the game, and then Pillsbury had a rather easy time of it. And again, if it's black to move here, black is probably winning by just playing king d6 and taking this pawn. And Pillsbury has a way to defend his pawn by playing brilliant breakthrough e4. And the idea is, one way or another, white is going to get a pawn on d5, protecting his e6 pawn, and black can't take that pawn because the e pawn would promote. It doesn't matter if black plays king d6 or black takes on e4, white's going to get a pawn on d5, either by e takes d5 or d5. Black took the pawn, which makes sense. d5 check. The king has to go to d6 to stop the pawns. Pillsbury played king e3. And Pillsbury, in my opinion, saw this position when he played knight b4, the original position, to get to this king and pawn ending, which is fairly clearly winning because of the two passed pawns in the center. Black tried to get something going on the queen side, but it doesn't work. Then he tried to get something on the king side. A lot of times, if black can get past pawns on both sides of the board, white's king can't stop them. Unfortunately, in this position, h5 gives white a dangerous pass pawn much more than it does for black. Black plays the obvious b3, takes an a3, then king c3 wins, and this pawn is stopped, and we have lots of passed pawns everywhere. So black tried h5 instead of resigning, and now white's h pawn is going to promote. Now black wants to play b3, so Pillsbury played king c4, and then white's h pawn obviously too fast, and in this position Gunsberg resigned. So brilliant endgame from Pillsbury, and the brilliant part is not only the moves that he played, but more importantly, how far ahead he saw when he played knight b4. He had to see what was going to happen, otherwise he can't play that sequence of moves. So a brilliant sequence, and Pillsbury went on to win the game, as you see. Okay, our next game is a game Pillsbury versus Emanuel Lasker. This was played in St. Petersburg, 1895 also. Black took back, and we got this ending of 6 pawns each with a knight versus a bishop with pawns on both sides of the board. Typically, in most positions, grandmasters would rather have black because they like the bishop against the knight, especially in this open position. But Since white's pawn structure is so solid on the queen side, and black has an isolated A pawn, and white's knight is dominating in the center, this all adds up to good winning chances for Pillsbury. Although during the game, Lasker might have thought he had a good position. So white moved his king up, which I tell my students to do, but they usually don't listen. But move your king up in the endgame. Lasker played king d8, getting his king over to the queen side. White also gets his king to the queen side. Black plays king b6. White plays f4, gaining space on the king side. And it's very weakening for black to ever play c5, because that makes his d pawn weak, and it gives away the d5 square, which the white knight could try to go to. And it also stops black from playing king c5. So if black ever plays c5, black is just making his king much worse. So he plays h5, stopping white from advancing on the king side. h3, king goes to c5. That's why Lasker moved his king to d8 and c7 and b6. f5, closing in the white bishop. Now white wants to play g4, g6, f6. f6 is a dangerous move for both players because that pawn might promote, or if we misjudge the position, maybe the king will run over and take the pawn. So f6 looks pretty safe because the black king is so far away, and white wants to play knight f3, knight g5, and pressure the f pawn. d5 was played. Lasker wants to come over and take that f pawn. Takes, king takes. Lasker's getting close. He's trying hard. Knight f3, king e6, knight d2, and now we see the weakness of the a5 pawn is more important than the weakness of the f6 pawn, because when black takes this pawn, black has a pawn majority. The pawns aren't going anywhere. When white takes this pawn, white has a passed a pawn that's very far from the black king. So they traded those pawns. Knight c4. And Lasker decides, instead of defending and trying to get his king to stop the a pawn, which means black is, playing for a draw and doesn't have any active prospects. In those kind of cases, if the black king gets here to stop white's a pawn, white's king can walk in and black doesn't really have any counterplay. So instead, Lasker goes for the king side, and he figures his bishop can sacrifice for the passed pawn later, and he can get some passed pawns of his own. Knight b6. This not only attacks the bishop, but it stops bishop c8. So that means this pawn is getting dangerous. Bishop f5. Lasker wants to play bishop e4 and c5 so he can stop the pawn from queening. King d4, bishop e4, a5, c5 check. What Pillsbury was going to do was play king c5 next move, and then this pawn just queens. And white would be many tempi ahead winning. And so Lasker sacrifices his c pawn to stop the pawn from queening, and he hopes to win these two pawns, and it'll be a pawn race. Now, the problem Lasker has is Pillsbury wants to play a7 and then knight d5 check, blocking the bishop from the a8 square. Man, the truth hurts. I'm not sure what to do about that. I guess Lasker could play king e5, stop the knight from going here, but Lasker wanted his king to take these pawns. So he played g5, knight d5 check. King e5 is forced, otherwise white queens. Now white can't queen because bishop takes the knight. Knight e3, the bishop has to stay on the diagonal to stop white from queening, but that means these pawns aren't as strong because white has a blockade, and white has another passed pawn also. b4, b5, Lasker tries to run back. Knight d5. If you take the pawn, I have knight c7 check, or a7, they both win. Again, white's threatening a7, a8, so black has to play bishop f3, but instead Lasker resigned. If Lasker plays bishop to f3, the easiest way to win is b6, and then takes, and then b7. And then that's white gets a queen, and even 100 years ago, players were good with an extra queen. 130 years ago. So a brilliant endgame from Pillsbury, who sacrificed his f-pawn to lure Lasker's king over to the king's side. He then won the pawn on a5 and was pushing his passed pawns, and his passed pawns proved to be faster than Lasker's pawns. Pillsbury wins a brilliant endgame, showing in this particular endgame that the knight is no worse than the bishop. The knight's not only stopping the bishop, it's also stopping the black pawns. The knight's a good defender also. So the knight was doing double duty, and I think one of the big reasons Lasker lost is he moved his king up, then he moved his king back, and Pillsbury just moved his king to the right position, defending his b pawn and defending the d5 square. So another brilliant endgame from our topic. Okay, and this was a famous endgame where I did some secret illegal analysis and found that Tarrasch had blundered, and it actually was a very reasonable blunder. This is Pillsbury versus Tarrasch from Nuernberg, 1896. And they got this queen and pawn ending where obviously it's equal material, but white has a passed pawn. So in queen and pawn endings, you got to have a passed pawn. And this isn't the only queen and pawn ending that we're going to see this lecture. So Tarrasch played king g7. Pillsbury went for the king and pawn endgame because he has two connected passed pawns. And in this position, Tarrasch made the losing move. Of course, it's easy to say now what people should do because we have engines. So the engines tell us everything. And in this particular position, the only move to maintain a drawn position is king to f7. Then the engine gives lots of variations and says black can hold a draw. But, you know, from a practical perspective, just looking at the position, I would assume white's winning. White has the two connected passed pawns. And what Tarrasch did is Tarrasch said, I want counterplay, but my counterplay is not fast enough. If I play a5, the king goes to e4, the king goes to d4, and it's very similar to the endgame we saw in the first game where white has two passed pawns and the king is stopping the queen side. So Tarrasch said, I have an idea. I'm going to make the king move away from the queen side, and then I'm going to make a queen. And so Tarrasch played the losing move, g5 check. Only loses by one tempo, but that tempo is important. Takes, and now Pillsbury can't stop the queen side pawns and the king side pawn. If he plays king e4, I push this one, and the king can't go in both directions. So Pillsbury takes on g5, and now this is why Tarrasch played g5. Now he plays a5, and black's pawns are unstoppable. The question is, who's quicker? And the answer is Pillsbury is quicker, which I'm sure he knew when he played king takes g5. He played d6. King has to go move over. King f5. e6 check. And this position, white only has one winning move. And what's funny is, this reminds me of an endgame that I had where my opponent blundered and lost the game. And if white wants to lose the game, white can play e7, threatening king e6 and mate. And e7's a blunder because black plays king f7. And I did the exact same thing with black in a game I played about 30 years ago in the World Open. And now white can't promote, and black's going to promote, so black would win. Okay, so Pillsbury, and also if Pillsbury plays d7 check, king e7, and again white can't get anywhere. So Pillsbury correctly played king f6, the only winning move. b3, not much left on the board. And unfortunately for Tarrasch, if he plays b2, he queens one move too late because Pillsbury queens would check, and then white easily stops the pawn and captures the pawn and wins. So after king f7, Tarrasch resigned. If you have an engine, it's worth going over this position after king f7 and seeing what the engine says about why the position should be a draw. I'm not sure if Tarrasch would have drawn if he had played king f7, but I perfectly understand g5 check because this allows Tarrasch to promote his pawn also. It's just that he's one move too short. So a nice win by Pillsbury, and you have to win endgames that you're winning, and you have to win endgames you're not winning if you want to be a great endgame player. And a lot of times you put pressure on the opponent and they only have one move that draws and they can't find it, and then, ends up losing the game. Let me flip the board. Okay, this is the game Carl Schlechter versus Pillsbury, played in Vienna in 1898. Black is a pawn ahead, white is in check, and here white made a mistake. The engine, once again, with the table bases and looking 50 moves ahead, says after king h3, white should be able to draw. It doesn't mean that white would draw. It means if two engines were playing, then white could draw. And a lot of times in queen and pawn endings, where the engine says it's a draw, the side that's trying to win, obviously black, does win because the drawing sequence is, for an engine, not so difficult, but for a human, it's impossible. And he played king g1, which is actually the worst king move. The engine actually slightly prefers king h1, which I don't understand. So king g1, not good. And now Pillsbury did something I've never seen before. He made two king walks. He walked up the board, and then he walked back down the board, and that won the game. And this isn't a winning position yet, but black is now better. Black plays king f7. Black wants to walk the king up the board and get with the pawn and the queen and get shelter that way. And white gives 1 billion checks. But do those checks bounce? King h1, so now the king can't cross the e file. King f6. King f5. Now if you play king h1, you just lose to queen e4 check. So now the checks start. The queen on c2 defends g6. It's never too late to blunder. sometimes people get tired at the end of the game and they make a move like king e4 and now white wins. Terrible. Okay, but Pillsbury's not going to do that. White moves the king over, or black moves the king over to the queen side. Black is trying to get shelter from the white queen. White keeps checking. Eventually white doesn't check. In this position, if white plays queen e1 check, then queen b1 wins because it pins the queen to the king. So he plays queen e3, stopping the pawn. Queen b2. Now there's no diagonal checks, and you can't check on the first rank because queen b1 would pin the queen and win. So now black can start moving their pawn. And white just says, okay, if you move your king, I'm going to check you. And I'm going to check you forever. And now Pillsbury does a second king walk. And I haven't seen that before. He moved his king up the board, and now he moves his king down the board to avoid checks. And the safe square he's going to go to is h6 because the queen is on d2, preventing any checks on the diagonal. And in this position, white resigned because black is going to play queen check and promote. And white has one check. White can check on c7. Then the king is safe on h6. And the funny part is, if, for example, if white threatens to play queen here mate, not only does queen protect the square, it's also checkmate. And now people on YouTube will say, that's not checkmate. White can play queen c1. Man, people on YouTube are tough. Okay, so that's funny that by black promoting to a queen, that not only is mate, but it stops white from playing queen h8 check. So I've never seen that idea. Black moved his king up the board to get shelter and escort his pawn. Then he moved his king back down the board to get to h6 shelter and then promote his pawn because the white king is trapped on the back rank. And that's why it would have been better earlier when we started the position if white's king was on h3. Then black wouldn't have all these queen checks and promote. And if white checked on the back rank, which I suggested several times, if black plays king b1, queen b1, he pins the queen to the king. That's why the white king belongs on h3. That allows white to check on the back rank. Of course, in the 1890s, a lot of these things weren't known. And Schlechter was famous for not losing, but even in this ending, which by computer standards should be a draw, he wasn't able to thwart Pillsbury's king walk, his king march to the front, then his king march back to h6. And I must admit, I've never seen a queen and pawn ending where black did a king march to escort his pawn. I've seen that many times, but I've never seen him go back and then get to safety on the king side. That's pretty awesome. And in this position, Schlechter resigned. The truth hurts. Okay, and I think Pillsbury's white. This was another example of if somebody played perfectly, they would draw, but playing perfectly is impossible. So instead, Pillsbury won in brilliant fashion. This is the game Pillsbury Showalter from their match in 1897 to see who would be the U.S. champion. They don't do that now. Now they have round robin tournaments. But they used to, the guy who was the U.S. champion would be like, I'll play you. And then they get the two best players in the U.S., Showalter, Pillsbury. Often it was Frank Marshall. And they would play for the U.S. championship, just two people. And even though Pillsbury was ill, He won the match 11-7 with 3 draws against Showalter. Showalter was a very strong player. A lot like Pillsbury, Showalter was underappreciated in his time. Although Showalter, not quite as good as Pillsbury, but better than his reputation. Most people haven't heard of Jackson Showalter, whereas most people have heard of Pillsbury. Okay, Showalter played rook e4, which is the correct move. And white has to decide which pawn to defend. And he made the correct decision to play g5 and give black a choice of which pawn to take. Black took on g5 because the g6 pawn is going to be too strong, and then took the pawn on d4. Now black has 2 connected passed pawns, but in rook endings, more important than how many passed pawns you have, and white does have more, is how far advanced they are. And the far advanced pawn in this ending is the pawn on g5. So Pillsbury played rook e3, stopping the king from coming over and stopping the pawn. And now if rook to g4, rook g3 gains a tempo against the rook. So black played c5 because black has passed pawns too. g6, rook a4, attacking this pawn with check, and also getting the rook back to stop the g pawn. a3, saving his pawn. And in this position, Showalter made the losing move. And this is the kind of losing move that we tell our students to make. If the correct move, which the engine says should lead to a draw, is a move we don't like. Okay, in rook endings, you have to play actively. You have to push your passed pawns. You have to attack. You have to have an active rook. And the engine says, I don't know anything about that, but you have to play rook a7 and stop the pawn from going to g7. And the engine says after rook a7, black should be able to hold the position. But black played more normal d4 because you got to get your own pawns going. Rook g3, and now you can't play rook a7 because g7 wins. You have to play rook a8, g7, and now white stops the black king from moving up, and white's going to push his a pawn, and black doesn't have enough going on to fight back. c4, king e2, and this is why you want rooks behind passed pawns. The other rook is useless. If it moves, white promotes to a queen. If black moves the king over here and takes the pawn, then the a pawn's going to promote. The black king can't stop both. So he plays king e6, a4, king f6, rook g3. If black takes the pawn, white takes the rook, and white promotes the a pawn. So king f5, king f4, white stops black's pawns, and white's going to play a6, a7, and rook f8, make a queen. Black plays for tricks. White has 2 pawns on the 7th. Rook check, keeping the king back. Now rook to b8, rook check. It's never too late to blunder and lose. And a lot of times when I watch class players play, there's an ending, they're playing okay, and then there's just a brain fart for one move. White could play king c3, expecting d2, king c2, and instead black plays rook c2 mate. So you can always lose in chess no matter how winning your position is. White played king d1, black played c3. Now white's winning. The way that white won was actually pretty funny. But the reason white's winning is white plays rook check, and now white can promote a pawn, and that wins the game because the rook is stopping the c pawn. So for example, Pillsbury could queen, check, check here, and the rook is stopping the pawn, so white would win. But Pillsbury played a much funnier move, which I like more, which is rook c4 check. And the idea is Pillsbury wants to get two queens. So if you take the rook, I queen with check, and the engine announces mate in like 15 or something for white. So he played king to e3 instead, and then white queened. And then white can play king c1 and win, but he took the pawn because he's going to make another queen, and black doesn't have any resources here. If black takes, I just play here. If you play king d3, threatening check, I can check, and then I can queen, or I can take the rook. Everything wins. So instead, Showalter played a move I don't understand. I can't ask him. Played rook e1 check, forcing white to take it. There's no other legal move. And then black resigned. So I'm not sure what rook e1 check was, but I guess it was just a way of resigning. And a very brilliant endgame where both sides had passed pawns, both sides were queening them, but Pillsbury's calculation was just a little bit better than Showalter's. Okay, and last but not least, we have this game, Wolf versus Pillsbury. Pillsbury's black. Black's up a pawn, but actually white has enough resources to draw if he plays like an engine. And unfortunately, this game was played in 1902. They didn't have engines. So a lot of times when Pillsbury had a better ending and the engine said, no, that's okay, you can still draw, they couldn't draw. It was too difficult. And this is a good example. I would just assume black is winning. Black's up a pawn and has 3-1 majority on the queen side. Black played rook check, king to d5, that's correct. Rook g3 is correct. And in this position, according to the engine, and it's very surprising to me, white can draw by playing rook g4 and then king c6. And somehow this position is drawn. I don't know why it's drawn. I guess black doesn't have a way to force a win. And if black plays the rook to b4, which looks like it wins, we have rook here threatening mate, and then we have a perpetual against the black king. So if black can't play rook b4, it's hard to find another winning method for black. Okay, but I would never play rook g4. That hangs my h-pawn. So white played king c6, which is a mistake. c4, rook to the back rank, rook a6 check. And now in this position, white played king c7, which is another mistake. White should play king d5. Again, too complicated. And now black played an excellent move. White's actually threatening checkmate. Remember, it's never too late to blunder. King a7, rook g3, stopping the c-pawn, rook h4, rook c3. And now in this position, black should play rook d4, which should win the game. He played king a6, and now white blundered again. White has to play king d6 in this position, and white played king c6. And now after rook d4, white is in zugzwang. White can't move his king, because then b5 would win, and white can't move his h-pawn, because I take it. And if white moves his rook, that's what happened. White moved his rook, now black plays c3, and now the game's over. After rook takes, black wins easily. Black has two passed pawns, and the white king can't get behind them, although that's still losing. Can't get in front of them, and so the pawns just promote. this pawn's not dangerous, black rook is stopping it, then black just moves the pawns up and king and wins. So actually after c3, Wolf resigned, and I put this on the engine, and it said black is +6. So that means black is winning very easily. Anyway, that was several endgames where Pillsbury either won by force or won with better positions because his opponents couldn't find the right defense. And that was common throughout Pillsbury's career. And unlike 20, 30, 40 years ago, when people got mated in the opening, Pillsbury won a lot of endgames. He was one of the first world's top players to win a lot of endgames with his good technique and better positions usually to start. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor, James A. Williams from Galax, Virginia. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife, Karen. If you're watching on YouTube, her information's on the screen now. I'll see you guys next time with more great players of the past. Go Harry Nelson Pillsbury. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.